Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the forum. We're very pleased to have with us a distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Robert Gallucci, who is the Ambassador at Large with the United States Department of State. He has a very distinguished career. He's done a lot of academic teaching at a number of fine institutions around the United States, but he's held at the Department of State and for the U.S. government a number of very significant posts. I'll just mention a few of them to give you a flavor of the breadth of his experience. He's been a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff. He has been on the faculty of the National War College. In 1991, he was the Deputy Executive Chairman of the United Nations Special Commission overseeing the disarmament of Iraq. In 1992, he was a senior coordinator responsible for non-proliferation and nuclear safety initiatives in the former Soviet Union. That's with the Office of the Deputy Secretary of State. From July 92 to August of 1994, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. And in 1994, he was named an ambassador at large. He's been engaged in a very important issue in our time with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which many of us had spent our lives focused on the Cold War. It was such an exciting prospect to see the symbols of totalitarianism come down, only to discover that some of the techniques of totalitarianism were in fact being used to prevent proliferation of nuclear materials out of the Soviet Union, compounding the problems that we now face that come out of the Cold War of what to do with the nuclear materials, the information, the knowledge, the scientists that is available now in somewhat at a greater pace around the world. And so we're very pleased to have, speaking on one of the most critical issues of our time, the Ambassador at Large, Dr. Gallucci.
Thanks very much. I know it's traditional to say I'm pleased and honored to be here. It's also, in my case, true this evening. I am pleased and honored to be with you this evening. The title for this talk, I believe, is Negotiating Nuclear Nonproliferation. And I'd like to negotiate my way to the topic, which is to say that I'd like not to begin talking right away about the spread of weapons of mass destruction, but I'd like to talk about the nature of the world first before doing that. I want to do that because it seems to me that for a long time we didn't have to do that to talk about nuclear weapons proliferation. For at least the last 20 years I've been doing this, there was an assumption about the nature of the world. It was pretty simple in structure, and it had implications, and proliferation fit in a certain spot. For the last 5 years that has not been so, and it seems it is worthwhile, therefore, for us to take a step back and say what we think about the international system, what it's like and its structure. So let me do that first, and I'll try to be fairly brief. It's certainly true that a lot of things have changed, and we tend to focus on that. But some things about the international system haven't changed, and they're just as important to recognize. First, the international system even now remains a self-help system. For all that we have said, and we used to call it the coming of the New World Order, that kind of fell away a little bit after a while. But generally we have seen trends, or thought we have seen trends coming that would change the way states related one to another in the international system. It seemed to us that economics were going to become more rather than less important in the future. There was a trend towards even economic primacy in relations to states, we have thought. Secondly, we thought interdependence would increase, economic and political interdependence between nations, and that would become extremely important. Indeed, non-national actors would become increasingly important, nation states less important in some important ways. We thought certainly there was going to be a movement in a direction of free enterprise and market economies away from command economies. And coincident with all this, we saw this new situation developing with the demise of the Soviet Union and international communism. We saw a move towards more democratic institutions away from authoritarian and totalitarian institutions. All this seemed to suggest that in the future, if we looked ahead, force would become less rather than more important. And my first proposition for you this evening is that that all may be true. In fact, I suspect all of what I said is true, but it is not as true as we might have thought it would be or as we might have hoped, which is to say that military force, force projection capability, the threat of the use of force, it seems to me, are still very important components in defining our national security and essential qualities of international security around the world. That's important for us as a basic proposition to begin with. They bear directly on our ability to achieve values that we hold dear and to achieve stable relations between states around the world, particularly in regions which we characterize as vital. As someone said, we have not yet come to the time when the lamb and the lion will lie down together unless you're prepared to change the lamb every day. And this is an indication that we're maybe working in that direction, but we're not yet there. Second basic proposition is that regional interests and U.S. national objectives in regions around the world have endured remarkably well in this changed world, and particularly with respect to vital U.S. national security interests. For example, our interests when we look at Europe are essentially the same as they have been for 100 years or more. We are looking for free, independent, strong states under the control of no external hegemonic power. That means, in short, that NATO is still extremely important to us in Europe. And Japan, as we look at Asia, we could say approximately the same thing about a free, secure Japan, particularly one secure in alliance with the United States, having no interest in the acquisition of nuclear weapons and having no interest in a further capability to project military force. Japan, Europe, vital areas of American interest. The Middle East, another area of vital interest. We have a continuing interest in securing the safety of our friends in the region, our access to resources, oil, read that as oil, and again to opposing any hegemonic interest in the Middle East. One could continue, I picked three areas just as an illustration of what are not only enduring interests that have transcended the end of the Cold War, but are actually almost classical in terms of American diplomatic history. They precede the Cold War. They still define U.S. interests abroad. And as you think about national security, including the proliferation issue, you ought to think of it in regional terms and put it in the context of those interests. That said, about what's endured in the international system, there clearly has also been change, and the change has come in international structure or in the distribution of power. The world, as everybody knows, is no longer bipolar. Because it is not bipolar, it means certainly that we no longer look around and assess regional situations in quite the zero-sum way that we did for decades. What is a loss for the United States is not a gain for some other entity like the Soviet Union. There is no bilateral ideological contest of the same kind. That means, while that's of course good news at the most fundamental level, it also means that life gets a little more complicated for the policymaker as he tries to define American interests, particularly vital interests in regional situations that develop. When is the use of military force by the United States consistent with the U.S. vital interest? And indeed, should military force only be used to secure vital interests, or might the United States properly use military force for simply important issues or interests that bear upon values of the United States? And when you think about that, I ask you to think about Somalia in those terms, to think about Bosnia in those terms. It becomes a lot harder case for the policymaker to not only define for himself when we should intervene, but also to defend that intervention. And you have seen this administration, the last administration, struggle with that, and I can promise you in the coming weeks you'll see more of that. Third, the strategic nuclear threat to the United States is massively reduced, and that is fundamental good news. It has not been eliminated, and you should all remember that thousands of nuclear weapons, I don't mean you have to remember this on a daily basis, but in this context, thousands of nuclear weapons are still in the hands of those who, if they wish to target them on the United States, could cause tremendous damage. I use vast understatement with that phrase. So the strategic nuclear threat from central systems has not gone away entirely, but is vastly reduced, as is the threat of large conventional war. There is no longer a Warsaw Pact. NATO, while tremendously important to our security, plays a different role than it did when there was a Warsaw Pact. Large conventional war in Europe essentially eliminated as a concern, at least in the near term. Fifth, U.S.-Russian relations are changed. However, Russia, I would argue to you, is still the single most important state to determining the future security of the United States of America. Our need is to continue to focus upon developments in the former Soviet Union, particularly in Russia. We have a vital interest in how the Russian situation evolves over time. Certainly, it impacts upon the future of Europe and the future of Asia, future of Middle East, three regions I pointed to before. We have to manage and help the Russians manage three transitions, as Strobe Talbot has called them. The political transition from a totalitarian society to a democratic society, an economic transition from a market economy from a command economy to a market economy, and perhaps the most difficult of all, a transition from a psychological transition from a empire to a nation state. Extremely important to assist the Russians in that transition, important to maintain domestic support for our role in that in this country. Important, but not an easy thing to do, as we are finding out. Sixth, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It seems to me that the threat posed to the United States of America and the threat to international security from the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, has increased in its import rather than decreased over the last 10 years. You may wonder why this would be so in the world that I was just describing. If we look back over time, you might say that the problem has seemed to diminish rather than grow greater. In some sense, it has. 30 years ago or so, almost 30 years ago, when I was a graduate student, we were looking at projections of the nuclear proliferation that were quite ominous. There were at the time 5 declared nuclear weapon states, and in addition, there was at least one state, Israel, whose, let's say, status was ambiguous. We were projecting, however, that by the time the middle 70s came around, there'd be 15 or 20 more nuclear weapon states, and by the time the middle 80s came around, probably more like 20 to 30 nuclear weapon states. That was the best guess at the time in the middle 60s. Instead, what we have now are still 5 declared nuclear weapon states, the same 5. There is ambiguity, if you will, about Israel, also Pakistan and India. There is concern about Iraq, Iran, Libya, and still, I imagine, North Korea. But in fact, we haven't had the massive turn to nuclear weapons status that we had projected. In fact, if we look at the last 20 years or so, we've had some fairly good luck in this connection. I'm not sure luck is exactly the right word, though it's had something to do with it. Countries that were of concern, like South Korea, Taiwan, Brazil, and Argentina, have actually moved away from nuclear weapons programs. Indeed, a country like South Africa that had actually manufactured nuclear weapons has taken them apart and subjected the nuclear material to IAEA safeguards and joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Institutionally, we look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was just recently this spring extended indefinitely. We look at the Nuclear Suppliers Guidelines. This is a group, it's a set of norms accepted by exporting countries, has been made more rigorous and tighter. So you might say this is a lot of good news as compared to, say, the picture some years ago. Why are you telling us that the threat is increasing rather than decreasing? And there are essentially 2 reasons for that that I would pick out. There may be more. The first is fissile material availability. To understand this, I would take you back a little bit, and you may remember that there was a news story about a Princeton sophomore who produced a design for a fission weapon. and it was pronounced adequate. It would work if built, and it raised questions in many people's minds. If this sophomore at Princeton could produce such a design, why don't more countries have nuclear weapons? Why don't more sophomores have nuclear weapons? The answer really has to do with fissile material. As it turns out, right now, the design of a fission weapon, the schematic is not a very difficult thing. It's not much of a secret. Some would argue that even the schematic of a thermonuclear weapon isn't much of a secret anymore after the publication some years ago in the Moreland case. But certainly the theoretical difficulty of designing thermonuclear weapons remains substantially greater than fission weapons. Materials availability or requirements for thermonuclear weapons are not nearly as much of an obstacle once you have the materials for a fission weapon. And the key in terms of capability, putting attentions aside, is the acquisition of the fissile material. And if it were more readily available, I put before you the proposition, then we'd have to worry a great deal about many more states acquiring nuclear weapons and non-national actors. That's unusually and unnecessarily jargony. Bad guys getting nuclear weapons. That situation, the availability of fissile material, we believe has been changed, at least potentially, by the demise of the Soviet Union, otherwise unmitigated good news. With the absence of the Soviet Union and its structures, we are now confronting a situation in which there are literally tons of highly enriched uranium, hundreds of kilograms of plutonium available, and I put that in quotes, not literally available, but potentially available within the former Soviet Union. This material comes from the nuclear weapons that are disassembled in some cases, and also from that material which is present in the Russian fuel cycle, civil fuel cycle, which is integrated in some areas with military facilities. That's just a lot of material under control, which is less firm, if I can put it that way, than before. That is not to say that we are not working on that. We are not trying to address that. Particularly the Nunn-Lugar legislation has gone a long way to help us work with the Russians on materials accountancy, on security of transport, of the nuclear weapons. Indeed, we even went so far as to open a science center in Moscow to get at the question of the scientists and engineers who have this capability, so that they did not leave the former Soviet Union and go elsewhere to other countries with perhaps far too much sand in them to ply their trade when they were no longer supported in Russia under its situation, its economic condition. So the fissile material problem, we believe, has been seriously exacerbated, at least potentially. I point out now parenthetically, in addition to the Russian case, the potential in the North Korean case, which I'll come back to. North Korea was headed in the direction of producing facilities that would yield about 150 kilograms of plutonium each year. That's enough for about 30 nuclear weapons. And our approach to this was not only to be concerned about the implications for Northeast Asia were this to come to pass, but also a concern about export of plutonium to other countries in the world. The second factor I'd point to is the factor we might just shorthand as ballistic missile availability. We have been for some time concerned about export of ballistic missiles or ballistic missile technology, and we formed a regime not unlike the nuclear regime. It is called a Missile Technology Control Regime to try to limit the trade in ballistic missile technology. Our concern with ballistic missiles is that it enhances the capability to deliver weapons of mass destruction. This is not only nuclear weapons, also conventional weapons, also chemical weapons and biological weapons, but nuclear weapons are certainly the most troubling if mated with ballistic missiles. Some of you may wonder if the other means of delivering nuclear weapons are just as threatening as ballistic missiles, and I would suggest to you that traditionally we do not think so. That yes, a nuclear weapon can be kicked out the door of an airplane, or it could be delivered with a boat or an ox cart, but generally we think the vulnerability of states, vulnerability of our allies and our own forces when they are deployed is substantially greater if ballistic missiles are available to deliver those weapons. Certainly in the case of the Gulf War, we witnessed what even simple Scud technology would mean for Israel, Saudi Arabia, our own forces, were that technology to be mated with nuclear weapons. What that has meant to us is that our concern about nuclear proliferation has been exacerbated because the possibility of the vulnerability of continental United States as well as our allies is out there if ballistic missile technology is not controlled. We are at the point now where, in the case of North Korea, we have one instance in which, in the world of nonproliferation, we put many of these factors together. And if I could say a word about the nature of that case and our approach to it, and then I think I will stop and we can turn to a discussion of these issues. The North Korean case is particularly interesting. It is an ongoing case. It is not yet resolved, but we are in the position of saying so far so good. Someone said that was said by the fellow who fell off the 20-story building as he passed the 10th floor. And so we're painfully aware that this agreement can go bad, but so far so good. What we were dealing with in North Korea are several of the elements I described. We were dealing with a case in which North Korea was known to have threatened the regimes that we have put in place by announcing its intention to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, by violating its international safeguards undertaking, by not accepting so-called special inspections of a couple of sites, by building and operating a small 5-megawatt reactor that was producing about 5 or 6 kilograms of plutonium a year, by building a reprocessing facility that extracts the plutonium from the spent fuel, and by having under construction at least, 2 larger reactors, one at the 50 megawatt range and the other at the 200 megawatt range. And when you put all this together, with all those facilities completed, as I indicated to you, the capacity the North Koreans were headed towards within, let's be generous, 3 to 4 years, was one which they could produce about 30 nuclear weapons a year. That's substantial, even by the standard of the states I labeled just a little bit ago ambiguous. That's substantial capability, and even at this moment in a spent fuel storage pond in North Korea, there is contained in spent fuel about 25 to 30 kilograms of plutonium, which is enough for 5 or 6 nuclear weapons. So we are dealing in the North Korean case with a real nuclear weapons capability, the potential for real export of significant quantities of plutonium. At the same time, we're dealing with an extended range ballistic missile program. I don't mean just extended Scud, but I'm talking about 1,000 to 1,200 range missile we call the No-Dung, and there's another missile of even further range in the 4,000, 4,500 kilometer range also under development. These missiles have more to do with North Korean interest in earning exports and force projection than they do with dealing with a threat to South Korea, since their range far exceeds anything necessary to deal with a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And also is relevant to our weapons of mass destruction concern, because while ranges are significant, the accuracies are lousy, which tells us that these weapons are not designed for delivery of conventional munitions. Already we have seen we've seen Iran and North Korea engage in ballistic missile cooperation, that is to say transfers from North Korea to Iran. Our concern in this case was there'd be further ballistic missile transfers, which ultimately would be destabilizing to the Middle East. The program itself in North Korea is destabilizing in Northeast Asia. Not to try to overdraw this case, but we could see within a matter of just a few years, if this program were left unchecked, a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program in North Korea that would have disrupted in severe ways the international regimes on nonproliferation, which would have, combined with the ballistic missile program, seriously threatened countries in Asia, most notably and in the first instance, South Korea and Japan, leading to possible responses of one kind or another, which, and I'll like to leave it at this, which would fundamentally change the landscape, the security landscape of the Pacific region over the next 10 years, for the worse, naturally. So that image in Northeast Asia on the one hand, combined with the export image and the implications for the Middle East on the other, are extraordinary. It is against that backdrop and with that threat that we went into the negotiations with North Korea in June of 1993 and concluded what we call an agreed framework with North Korea in October of last year. Under the terms of that deal we struck with North Korea, their nuclear program is frozen. And by that I mean that the reactor doesn't operate, produce any more plutonium, spent fuel stays in the pond, doesn't get reprocessed, the processing plant is sealed up, construction stops on the two larger reactors. And eventually they get those facilities or radioactive waste sites that were to be inspected by the agency under a special inspection clause would get inspected and would find out whether the North Koreans were telling the truth or not about how much plutonium they separated in the past. So the deal, in a sense, wraps up the North Korean nuclear program, if fully implemented. Right now, it freezes the North Korean nuclear program. As you know, things that freeze can thaw, and so we have to be careful about what we claim for this agreement, but so far we claim very good success. The cost of this was not one, but two light water reactors that would be built in North Korea to replace the gas graphite reactors which have been frozen. The cost of those two reactors is about $4 billion. That cost is going to be substantially borne by the Republic of Korea and by Japan. Second benefit that flows to North Korea as a result of this agreement is what's called heavy fuel oil, which can be burned in power plants and replace the electricity that would have been produced by the gas graphite reactors had they still been running. And that's about 500,000 tons of heavy fuel oil each year until the first reactor comes online, and that costs about $50 million a year. That's the price tag, and that's the outcome. In describing this to you, I tried to do this in a kind of cold sort of way without the normal enthusiasm I have for describing this when I'm retelling this agreement. I really think it was fundamentally in the national security interests of the United States and certainly the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the rest of the international community. But clearly it was a negotiated settlement designed to fit this particular case. I'm often asked as we negotiate a deal such as this, what about the precedent? What about the example? And I tend to want to answer that by saying that no case looks exactly like this case. This is not a bad precedent. It's not a bad example. But I also want to say that precedent is a concept that fits more easily and more appropriately in a judicial setting than it does in international relations. We are not bound to deal with all cases the same way, and I don't know of another case where such extant capability needs to be chilled in quite the same way as this program did. We also don't believe that other states will, metaphorically, slam their palms into their forehead and discover as a result of the North Korean settlement that there's perhaps blackmail to be had in the acquisition of nuclear weapons. States that are thinking along those lines have been thinking those things for some time, and this will not be news to them. We think this settlement, as I said, is, as a negotiated settlement, very much in everybody's security interest. It is, moreover, a lot better than any alternative we were able to think of, and I would like you to contemplate that as well, that when you address problems of proliferation by means other than negotiation, think about doing so. You sometimes come to what is sometimes called counter-proliferation, and that's the use of military instrument to deal with a problem of proliferation. In this particular case, Secretary Perry said in open testimony that we considered the course of striking the nuclear facilities in North Korea, and he said, we know how to do that. And indeed we do, and it could be done, but not, we don't think, with any confidence that it would not provoke a land war on the Korean Peninsula, and that would be a very costly one indeed. So on its merits, as well as compared to alternatives that could be easily envisioned, we think the settlement was a good one. I would suggest as you think about this, you think about other problems in proliferation we have and the complexity of them. And I would point right away to the situation in South Asia right now. We face in South Asia two countries, both capable of deploying nuclear weapons in a very short amount of time. I can't tell you how short an amount of time would take for them to deploy weapons, but let me tell you that you might be able to look at your wristwatch to calculate it. This is a very dangerous situation. And second element in the situation is the potential availability of ballistic missiles of interesting ranges. The Indian indigenously produced Prithvi, and the possibility that the Pakistanis have access to Chinese-produced M11 missiles. The mating of these missiles with nuclear weapons, indeed the nuclear weapons launched by fighter aircraft, would create a very, very dangerous situation indeed. Put this missile, nuclear weapon situation, or elements of the situation aside, we also have, in the case of Pakistan and India, an ignition point in Kashmir, and have for some time. We have obviously a history of chronic conflict, and a conflict that's born of deep religious and cultural differences. So as we look around the world and look at situations which are dangerous, North Korea remains so. Iraq had a capability that went very far along, and while it has been dismantled, the capability to put it back together again would exist once the Iraqis obtained the capability. Iran and Libya have the intention, we believe, of acquiring nuclear weapons if given the capability. India and Pakistan are in the situation which I described to you as quite dangerous. The availability of fissile material from the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, together with the availability of ballistic missiles, makes the United States potentially vulnerable, even continental United States, to national or non-national groups. The situation, in other words, is one in which is in some ways a lot better than we would have anticipated some decades ago, but it is not one in which we can relax, and I think we have to look particularly to negotiated settlements if we want to deal with these issues successfully. Thanks very much.
The ambassador would be happy to entertain questions now. We have two microphones up here if people want to come to the mic and identify themselves very briefly and ask a question.
My name's Dave Potier. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I had a question about the threat, the arms race, in relation to the arms race that was going on in the Cold War. Now, do you see that the threat of massive retaliation is no longer a deterrent for these states? What happened to the issue of America's nuclear forces acting as a deterrent? And what situation do we face now that states have small numbers of nuclear weapons in comparison to the arsenal that we have?
This is if nuclear deterrence worked for all those years against the Soviet Union, how come it doesn't work against Iraq? Huh?
Exactly.
I don't know, it might. There's some difficult questions to answer when you ask a question about the U.S. nuclear deterrent as working against other countries that acquire nuclear capability. Certainly, I think one of the propositions about nuclear deterrence, it works best when it's credible. And it also works best when you think the other side calculates the way you calculate, or at least you know how they calculate, and they're subject to such a calculation. And there are endless arguments in the Soviet case about the likelihood that the Russians would behave the way we thought they would. I think maybe the evidence is that they would and did. It is not clear that we want to bet on the case of a particular leader in a particular case always behaving that way. Let me mention a couple. Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-il. Maybe this will work, and maybe it won't. And I think that deterrence is a very good idea, and I'm glad we have it. But I don't know that at every turn we can count on it. One of the reasons for being suspicious of it is that we must, in this case, go for a special type of extended deterrence because we want not only to deter these states from using the nuclear weapons against us, but also against allies, friends, U.S. forces. And we have to be credible that if they do that, then we will, of course, respond. I have kind of, I guess, squished together the various elements of weapons of mass destruction. I didn't really distinguish between chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. My own view is that that lumping is not useful to clear thinking, but it is part of the current language in which we talk about these things. There's a vast difference between nuclear weapons and chemical weapons in terms of their consequences, and under the worst scenarios for chemical weapons. And while you can have some pretty horrendous scenarios for biological weapons, they're very hard to use as compared to nuclear weapons. So these are not the same. I bring that up because there was a little matter of deterring the Iraqis during the Gulf War from using chemical weapons, which they had available. They may well have had biological weapons available. We're pretty sure, someplace between pretty sure and positive, they did not have nuclear weapons available. And the question was how to deter their use. And as you know from the logic of these things, you never know when deterrence works. You only know when it doesn't. So in this case, we may or may not have deterred them from having used those weapons. I rather think we did by a variety of threats. So I guess all this talk amounts to the following kind of answer. I think our nuclear capability is relevant to deterrence when, of course, we can identify the attacker. This was all for nation states, and I only raised the question of the rationality of a particular leader as a possible problem. There is, of course, the terrorist threat. You want to deter the bombing in Oklahoma City? Do you want to deter what happened with the train or any of these other things? You've got to know the person you're deterring, and he's got to have something to strike. And one of the problems I'm alluding to here is that with the ready available of fissile material, if we ever get there, you are going to have a new kind of problem to deal with.
Hi, my name is Ajay Kuntamakala. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. I had a question about the impact of the North Korean situation on the Japanese-American security lines. When the situation first came to a head, I guess in '93, it seemed to me that there was a crack appeared in the once very, very stable relationship between U.S. and Japan. It seemed as if Japan was no longer deferential to its big brother in the West, now that the Cold War was over. For instance, Japan refused to support any oil embargo against North Korea, nor did they want the U.S. to undertake any military operations like a preemptive strike against North Korean facilities, nuclear facilities. What is your evaluation now that the North Korean situation is hopefully on its way to reconciliation? And now with the recent rape in Okinawa, what is the situation now as far as the security relationship? And how can the United States and Japan form a consensus in future security initiatives in the area?
I have some problems with the question because there are some propositions in the question which I don't think are accurate. So let me pick those up right away. When you talk about oil embargo on North Korea, we, at various points in this negotiation with the North Koreans, beginning in New York in June of '93, running all the way through until October of '94, we have had the specter, as they say, of sanctions resolution hanging over our heads. I mean, that makes it sound negative. It was actually a tremendous and wonderful thing to have hanging over our heads because I believe it helped the North Koreans to focus their minds, Dr. Johnson-like, on this, and that was good. And I think in relation to your question, a sanctions resolution had that effect, I believe, because we, the United States, were credible that we could get a sanctions resolution through the Security Council, which is to say that, and that it would be implemented. And so that the proposition there is that China would have abstained and not vetoed. And second, that the resolution would have had some teeth, and the teeth in the first instance, everybody knew had to be bared in Tokyo. That the Japanese had to bear a burden on this, a disproportionate burden, any sanctions resolution. And I'm here to tell you that they were prepared to do that throughout. So the first proposition that they shrunk from that is not accurate. I will say, though, that Tokyo was not enthusiastic about a sanctions resolution. Neither was Seoul, and neither was Washington. Neither was anybody who had any sense. This was not a terrific strategy or policy. It was, however, the one we were going to be forced to follow if we couldn't get a negotiated settlement. So I don't think there was a problem with Japan there. With respect to a conflict, the Japanese, of course, wanted to avoid any kind of military conflict in the region, but then so did everybody else. So there was no difference, I think, there either. And I would point particularly to June of 1994, when, if you recall, I think the press carried some of the profile of this, when the North Koreans discharged reactor fuel into the pond, and we said, well, we're not going to talk to you now that you did that because you irrevocably destroyed evidence that we needed to determine what you had done before, and we're going to go to the Security Council. In order to have a Security Council vote and be in a position to deal with what the North Koreans told us would be their response, we, the United States of America, were going to enhance our military presence in Northeast Asia. That was with air assets, naval assets, and on the ground. And we let that be known, and certainly that we couldn't do that without Japanese and South Korean concurrence, and we had it. So you're right about the lack of enthusiasm for this course, but not right about, in the end, the refusal to follow it. We all were doing it more in sorrow than in anger, or saying we would. I think about the Japanese-U.S. relationship, there is something to trying to separate the economic contentious aspects from the security. And there's nobody who knows more about that than a gentleman who was standing down here a little earlier in the evening, Joe Nye, who did probably more for making sure that that didn't go bad than anybody else in the U.S. government. That has to be managed, I would stipulate, and I think you're absolutely right. But I don't think we had the kind of problems in those elements that you described.
My name is Kent McNally, and I had a question about what you said about example and precedent. What I would see when I first heard of this, the solution to the problem would, we would have the big stick in America would tell these North Koreans to put their nuclear weapons away. But since we negotiated at this time and we will have a resolution as a result of negotiation, is this going to happen the next time a problem like this comes up? Have we in fact denied that we'll ever react militarily, or will we react like in a totally absolute manner if another like ambiguous nation or another nation threatens proliferation?
A while ago, I said, in kind of anticipating a critique, I gave a response which was, this need not be a precedent. And I want to say this need not be a precedent. But if you ever found exactly the same case, since I like this answer so much, I don't mind it being a precedent. The situation you describe though, with respect to military force, I think there's always going to be a great reluctance, I hope there is, to use military force to deal with a problem in international relations. I mean, it's one of the hardest decisions you ever have to take is when to do that. This particular case, it comes up because several of our critics, who are actually very well informed, have suggested that we should have threatened the use of military force and avoided the negotiation. Now, I think if this is, I said there was no good alternative. I was counting this one. And I was because I don't know that anybody could threaten the use of military force, and if you're the United States of America, not carry through on the threat. In other words, we can't bluff. You know, I mean, other people can bluff, but we can't bluff because that gets very expensive in terms of human life if we get caught bluffing. So if we say something in threat, we're going to have to use force. That means that if that was the threat, either you come back to the NPT, accept safeguards, or you lose those facilities. That means if they didn't respond, we'd have to take them out. And if we had to take them out, then the consequences could well be, we couldn't be sure, but they could well be a conventional conflict on the peninsula, which we would eventually win. But eventually, you know. So what I'm telling you here, I think, is that we'd look, I think, in any circumstance, real hard at a military option to see if there was one that made sense, but also made, I think, and I've been very tactical about this and not particularly focusing on ethical considerations, and they would obviously play a role in what would be politically plausible and defensible. There'd have to be a real threat, identifiable. We'd have to be able to demonstrate that the acquisition of weapons posed such a threat. I described to you very gently before the situation in Pakistan and India. I mean, nobody suggested that we intervene in those cases with military force to prevent these states from taking that sovereign decision, whatever it may be. They certainly are not declared nuclear weapon states. But the circumstance of Iraq, for example, is a much better case of a circumstance in which contemplating a counterproliferation to deal with an active nuclear weapons program might make some sense in the context of an overall conflict. But I mean, in the end, it's going to be case by case, and I think you should be glad it is.
Hi, my name is Gulay Singaliyev. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. I guess my question is in the same venue, but it's more concrete. Can you predict the reaction, the response of the United States to the recent Russian statement that Russia will aim the nuclear missiles at Poland and the Czech Republic at the moment when the NATO will be expanded, the NATO expansion decision will be made? And what do you think about the recent Russian decision to go ahead with the construction of the nuclear plant in Cuba?
I'm going to have to take your word for both of those. In other words, in responding, I'm sure it's right. I do. But in case you're not right, in responding, I am not now. I don't have any independent knowledge of this. I'm not reading my newspaper close enough. But let's say that the Russians have taken the position that the moment NATO's expanded to include Poland and the Czech Republic, that Russia will retarget its missiles. Should be pretty difficult, actually, technically, but let's put that aside. Retarget its missiles on Poland and Czechoslovakia. What do I think of that? I think that wouldn't be nice. No, seriously, we all know that the Russians have certain problems with the expansion of NATO. I think this administration has said quite clearly that this is a new world we live in. Their security in Europe is going to mean something different in the future than it did in the past. NATO has the potential of expanding. There are some states that may join NATO that are not in NATO. There are others which will not. We have a partnership for peace as a concept in which to bring states along. The Russians are very suspicious of all this. Some regard it as a threat. It raises nationalistic fervor in Russia, and all that's true. And my reaction to that statement would be that I would put it in that context, and I don't know that you're learning anything about the way the Russians would actually target their missiles were those countries to join NATO, is my view. With respect to the building of a nuclear reactor in Cuba, I would remain concerned about the safety of the reactor design that was used in the Cuban case, because it is close to the United States. I'm not now saying the Russians can't build safe reactors. I'd say that there have been problems with certain Russian designs in the past, and I'd be interested in knowing the design of this reactor. I'd be very interested in knowing what safeguards and non-proliferation standards were being applied, whether there's return of spent fuel, et cetera. And in the end, certainly, I would have to be convinced before I thought this was a good idea that this was indeed the most economic way of meeting Cuban energy needs, which I seriously and profoundly doubt.
Good evening, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Alex Rodriguez. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. And I'd like to ask you a question with regard to President Carter and his involvement. What role, if any, from inside the Department of State, did his involvement in the negotiations with the North Koreans actually either promote the U.S. agenda, or what effect did it have ultimately? And with that in mind, what are your personal observations as far as presidents or ex-presidents being involved in the negotiations or current negotiations in any diplomatic issue?
In case any of you didn't hear the question, he wanted to know how we're doing in the NPT. President Carter, I suppose most of you know, decided at a particular point, it happened to be the day after I was sent to Plains to brief him, but at that particular point, he decided after some thought that his personal visit, or his visit to North Korea on a personal basis, could help to relieve the tension that was building over over their program and our intention of dealing with it through sanctions. This was in June of 1994. He talked to the President Carter talked to President Clinton, Vice President Gore, and others before doing this, and the administration approved of President Carter making this private visit. It is my own personal view that the visit served extremely well to provide Kim Il-sung with a face-saving way of backing down in the crisis. When President Carter called us on the telephone and told us that there was a deal to be had and described it then on CNN, we the same day, within hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours, went back to change the deal slightly and raise the bar somewhat that North Korea would have to clear in order to come back to the negotiating table with us, and the North Koreans rapidly agreed to that. So it was not only the continuity of safeguards and not only the no reprocessing, but it was also no refueling of the 5-megawatt reactor. We got there and we got back to the table, in my view, I think largely due to the good work of President Carter, and I credit him with that. Now, about the general proposition about ex-presidents. Something tells me I shouldn't answer that question. But I only see one TV camera, so. It seems to me that any official, and I want to say any official like a former president, but there are no officials like former presidents, you know. There's a former president, and that's about it, can do remarkable things in helping a given administration deal with a certain problem. It's, I think, in my view, again, because I work in this administration, very important that such former presidents stay in very close touch with the administration and coordinate what they do, and that has certainly been the case with President Carter. So I think there's tremendous possibility there. It, of course, becomes another matter if there's a separate policy being pursued by a former president. I have not seen that in this case, and I visited the President Carter's center in Atlanta, and one cannot go there without being incredibly impressed by what he does around the world, not in association with the administration, but on his own. And that Carter Center is an incredible performance around the world and does enormous amounts of good, and does it with elections, with economic development, in all kinds of areas. The high profile he has gotten for the Korean presence, for what he did in Haiti, for what he attempted to do in Bosnia, I think were all in coordination with the administration, and they were good things to have done. I'm most familiar with the Korean case, and in that case I find that that moment was a very positive one for us, and as I said, allowed the North Koreans to come around to our position.
I'm Gabriel O from Korea. There is a high suspicion that North Korea has some nuclear materials with which North Korea can make some nuclear weapons. It seems to me that by listening to your speech this evening, the possibility of export of nuclear weapons from North Korea would be dangerous in your petroleum and the security of Israel, that means the Middle East. So I wonder, even the present materials is very important because that will have an impact of threatening North Korea, the American 35 young people stationed in Korea, as well as Korean security. I wonder, why didn't you include the special inspection in your negotiation? And U.S. government is still quite negative in raising the issue, even now, even though it is essential to Korean security and with the American young people in Korea.
Thank you. Let me try and answer that question. It's going to require a little detail, so please bear with me. The issue that I described to you and I came into the middle of arose when the North Koreans accepted what the IAEA calls full-scope safeguards inspections. And so the IAEA inspectors went over to North Korea to do what they do. They took samples and they looked everywhere. They went to a particular facility, it's called a reprocessing facility, where you extract plutonium from spent fuel. And they took little samples. Laboratory work was done. They asked North Koreans, so how much plutonium did you say again that you separated back around 1991? North Koreans said about 80 grams. And that was in one batch? They said one batch. So we got isotopic analysis here that says this couldn't happen with just one batch of reprocessing. Must have done more than one batch. So about the same time, the North Koreans heard from a concerned nation that the North Koreans had a couple of sites that looked a lot like radioactive waste storage sites that had been, let's say, covered up. One landscaped and the other had a building put on top of it. So the IAEA said, tell you what, we have a little discrepancy here. You're 80 grams in one batch or multiple batches. We don't know how much. I think if we got a look at the radioactive waste that you got at these other two sites, we could take some more samples and get an idea of volume and maybe figure out how much stuff you really separated. Those were called as special inspections, 2 sites. They're special because all the other inspections are worked out with the host government. These wouldn't be. These were on demand or request. That's about when the North Koreans said, nah, thanks anyway, you can't come. The IAEA couldn't deal with it, reported to the Security Council. So the first point I'm trying to make here is there's a question. And the question was how much material they separated in the past, and we might be able to find out, this is the royal we, the IAEA, the rest of the international community, if they could go to those radioactive waste storage sites and take some samples. Now, how much material could the North Koreans actually have separated? Well, we have folks who work in the U.S. government who looked at that reactor and its operating history and made the most optimistic assumptions from the North Korean perspective of operating history and of discharging the whole core and of reprocessing to figure out how much the maximum amount of material they could have. And they figured it was around 8 kilograms or so. So that's substantially more than 80 grams. In fact, it's enough for 1 or maybe a little more than 1.5 or so nuclear weapons. The technical problem here was special inspections. The material problem was 1 to maybe possibly 2 nuclear weapons. okay? That's how the issue arose. We looked at this issue, we the United States, and the government in the Republic of Korea and the government in Japan, not only in terms of the safeguards violation and 1 or possibly 2 nuclear weapons, but we knew that in the pond there were 25 to 30 kilograms of plutonium, for sure, as they say in California, right? And that if this was reprocessed, then you had maybe 5 nuclear weapons. Not maybe 1 or 2, but definitely 5. We then looked at the facilities under construction, as I described to you, the 15 to 200, and we're looking at 30 weapons a year. Okay, so we go into a negotiation with the North Koreans. What are we after? First of all, let's remember that when we say two sites not inspected, these are not facilities. They're radioactive waste storage sites. 1. 2, let's remember that if the North Koreans separated more than 80 grams, they did it already 6 years ago. They've got it. Now, unless you think they have had it for 6 years and they're only now going to start to fabricate a weapon out of it, doesn't make any difference in a sense of time. They've got it. What about the isotopics of going there and finding out? Well, it turns out, you know, that those isotopes are not going to disappear, given the half-lives. They're going to be there for a long time. So when we go into a negotiation, this is the royal we again, I have some objectives. And my first objective is not to get special inspections. It would have been if I was only concerned about the political image, because what I just described to you is much more information than the public in Korea, Japan, and the United States understands. They understood special inspections. Most people think they are sites that are actually facilities that operate. So we knew when we were going after real plutonium that's in the pond, for sure. We're going after plutonium production in the reactor, for sure. We're going after large reactors that produce enormous quantities of plutonium that, in terms of real national security and international security, much more important than getting those special inspections immediately. So we negotiate agreements, and we trade things off in objectives. And we made the call, and the call was that we needed, in the first instance, the first objective was to make sure that those spent fuel rods didn't leave the pond and get reprocessed, because we figured they would be about 6 months from weapons capability, and a significant number. We couldn't do anything about any material they already had right away. And so we put, in terms of our prioritization of objectives, we put special inspections relatively low down, because we wanted to get at capability we knew was there. We did get special inspections. Under the terms of the agreement, the North Koreans cannot receive a single bit of nuclear equipment for the first light water reactor until they accept special inspections and everything else the IAEA may require to satisfy itself that there is no problem in North Korea. So we got special inspections, but not right away. It's as a condition of what they have to do in order to get the light water reactor. They can get equipment for the power plant, non-nuclear components, but nothing nuclear under the terms of the agreed framework. So we traded one objective off the other for national security reasons. It has cost us politically, and you have just demonstrated that it has, because there is a widely held perception that either we only care about 5 or 100 nuclear weapons, but just 1 or 2 that would devastate South Korea doesn't bother us. That's not true. Or that we don't care about special inspections, which is not true. It's in terms of prioritizing real capability and real security, it didn't come up as high on the list, and quite honestly, and it's clear, and all negotiators have to say this at some point, we didn't get everything we wanted just the way we wanted it. And that's all I can tell you.
But considering the cost, as you mentioned, cost is more than $4 billion. But what you got is freezing instead of getting rid of all the possibility of making nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I understand that prioritize the objectives and you get, trade-off, then you get some part. But considering that even one weapon could be it could be very, very dangerous for the security as well as your young 35,000 soldiers, and that's of course the one very important part of your security concerns. So concession of that part seems to be very critical for the Korean security and U.S. soldiers. That's not the object of trading. I mean,
Actually, it is, and that's the world we live in. You pointed to the fact that there's a $4 billion price tag here. It's $4 billion plus $500 million a year, and that's true. That is the price tag that we've put on it, and it is also true that anything that you freeze can be thawed. Right? I said that before. But under the terms of the agreed framework, all the facilities are ultimately dismantled, all of them. All of the facilities are immediately frozen now, and all of them are ultimately dismantled. The spent fuel right now is being boxed up so it can be stored until it can be shipped out. And there's an American team in North Korea, Yangbyon now, working with the North Koreans to safely store that spent fuel so it's not reprocessed. The $4 billion price tag is the price tag for 2 light water reactors. That was a price that the Republic of Korea, government of the Republic of Korea, said it was very willing, indeed eager to pay, not the whole amount, but as they say, a central portion of that amount. And Japan was eager to pay a significant portion of that. And that should tell us all, I think, that both the governments in Japan and Korea believe that this was a good deal from the perspective of their national security. Now we come to the point that all negotiators have to deal with, which is, couldn't you have gotten more and given less? All I can tell you is if I could have, I would have. That was the best I could do. I don't think there was another alternative to the negotiated settlement. I've argued that already. I can't possibly tell you that another negotiator wouldn't have gotten more from the North Koreans than I did. I mean, there's no way I could affirm that to you. I myself don't believe that we would have gotten any more from the North Koreans. I also believe, and it's more important, that what we got was prioritized correctly. And it isn't that we don't care about the safety of 37,000 Americans or the 13 million people who live in Seoul. We do, and we think we went as far as we could to securing their safety under the circumstances. They all live under the threat of enormous conventional capability from the North Koreans in the form particularly of artillery, but also for a 1 million-man army, 600,000 of whom are forward deployed. This is a very dangerous situation. We did not cure the ballistic missile problem with this deal. We did not cure the conventional weapons problem with this deal. We did not cure cancer with this deal. What we went after was the nuclear program, and we have a solution that completely takes that program apart. I remind you, just one final point here, that if we went after what the international community wanted, which was safeguards, International Atomic Energy Agency full-scope safeguards, including special inspections, you could rest assured would know whether they had 80 grams or 8 kilograms, right? And everything would be inspected, right? And there'd be an NPT, right? And if we did nothing else but that, none of the other things, they could separate that plutonium into spent fuel. They could accumulate immediately within 6 months, 30 kilograms of plutonium enough for 5 bombs. And within 4 years, they could be churning out 150 kilograms of plutonium each year under safeguards. And they could export some of that for a lot of money to some other NPT parties, like Iran, Iraq, and Libya. And you have your NPT and your IA safeguards fully intact. Now, that to me would have been a bad outcome. It would have been consistent with regimes, but the regimes don't fit perfectly every circumstance. The agreement was tailored to a very unique circumstance, and I'd argue is in the end in your national security and ours. Thank you.
Ambassador, I think to get most of our questioners in, we might need to have them try to quickly give their questions, and perhaps you can give a little shorter answer to each of them. That would maximize participation.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Wuttke, and I'm a PhD student here. And my question is, for some days ago, we have had in Germany the 5th celebration day of a union, and I think it became success. What is your opinion about a possibility of union for North and South Korea, and for a better relationship between Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-sam?
Let's just go right down the line, and then we'll go over there. Okay.
Yeah, you spoke about the problem between India and Pakistan. So what makes Kashmir go so low down on the agenda of the Western nations? And the other question is, what made the current administration go back on the sanctions of the Pressler Amendment with regard to Pakistan?
This is Master from Michigan. Good evening. I have to for first-year student at Harvard College. I have a question, a small one, concerning how would the United States justify not contributing financially at all while acting as a protagonist in the negotiation process with North Korea?
Quick question about the retailing of the agreement. You've indicated that this is sort of the agreement that nobody loves, and I just wonder if you'd maybe talk a
My
little.
immediate family is very fond of it.
I know, and you as well. But I just wonder if you'd talk a little bit briefly about trying to explain this agreement to the American people, and how the things you did, the positions you took during the negotiations made that more difficult.
It seems that whether in North Korea or the former Soviet Union, non-proliferation is expensive, and also that Japan, you mentioned that Japan bore a significant share of the cost of the two light water reactors in North Korea. To what extent will Japan and our other allies assume the costs of these kinds of programs in the future, and under what conditions do you think that they will assume these costs?
I wonder whether any consideration was given during the negotiation process to having the Russians build light water reactors in North Korea as a way of buying them off from building similar reactors in Iran.
Wouldn't it be terrible if I slammed my palm into my forehead now and said, I wish I'd thought of that? Yeah.
How do you analyze the real intention of North Korea when they develop nuclear facilities? To what extent were they serious about having nuclear weapons, and for what purpose? To gain political hegemonic power, or using as a leverage to gain economic cooperation from the world?
Thanks. I have 7 questions here. The first, in light of the celebration of the Union of East and West Germany, what do I see ahead, or what do we all see ahead for the prospect of Union of North and South Korea? We haven't said anything about that, or at least I haven't said anything about that, and this is a good opportunity to do it. I don't think any of us who are engaged in this enterprise of trying to negotiate a deal with the North Koreans to take account of their nuclear weapons program and deal with it, thought that the deal we did had any chance of succeeding if it was not accompanied by a rapprochement between North and South Korea. In other words, that it is inconceivable to me personally, I would say, that over the 10 to 12 years this project would take, that it's all going to unfold with the thousands of South Koreans who will have to go north to build these reactors, that it's all going to unfold in the political atmosphere that we now have without the opening of a dialogue between North and South. Now, we haven't had the dialogue we want, but I would rapidly note to you that we've had South Koreans and North Koreans talking to each other under the umbrella of KEDO, this organization we set up, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization. They've talked to each other in Kuala Lumpur. They've talked to each other up at the site doing the site survey in North Korea. They're talking to each other not as a result of us, but as a result of very bad weather in the context of the rice talks. We hope that some of this will spill over. We think it will have to. Certainly the agreed framework requires the North to engage the South, though it doesn't give a time frame. So I would say to you that if we really want to deal with the causes of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, there's only one solution, and that is North Koreans talking to South Koreans. And I'm hopeful that it'll happen, and the framework will help make it happen. Second question had to do with South Asia. If, as I claimed, this was such a dangerous place, the question was how come Kashmir was so low down in our list of priorities, and by the way, how come you want to lift the sanctions in the Pressler Amendment to deal with Pakistan? I wouldn't say that Kashmir is so low down on our list of priorities. It is intervening in the Kashmiri situation is not an easy thing to do. We are not invited in at the moment by all those involved, and we must be very careful. I've read just yesterday some detailed reporting from Ambassador Wisner, who's in New Delhi, about the Kashmir situation. We are all concerned that it will get worse. We are hopeful that it won't. We are looking for ways to help. It is a difficult problem to engage ourselves in, and we have to be careful. And I hope you would all appreciate that in that circumstance. With respect to the sanctions of the Pressler Amendment, the Pressler Amendment essentially said that there was be no assistance to Pakistan unless the President could certify that Pakistan did not have nuclear weapons, and that any assistance or transfers to Pakistan would reduce the likelihood that Pakistan would acquire those nuclear weapons. At a particular point, the Bush administration decided it can no longer make the necessary certifications under the Pressler Amendment, and so some airplanes, particularly F-16s, but not only, that were in the pipeline which the Pakistanis had paid for could not be delivered. And the Pakistanis have come to us with a request that we do something about that, either give them back their money or give them their aeroplanes. The administration also is confronted with a request to do other things that would somewhat improve relations between the United States and Pakistan, which have been somewhat strained over this, while at the same time not retreating at all from our concern about the Pakistani nuclear program. What the administration has proposed to do is to lift, in a limited way, some of those sanctions so that the problem of, part of the problem of the F-16 can be handled, but also so that some equipment can be delivered to Pakistan. It is an attempt at a more moderate approach, one that does not single out Pakistan quite the way the current situation does, as opposed to, for example, India. So I'm not here to tell you that there's any change at all in our concern about the nuclear situation in Pakistan, just that there's a change in the way we're trying to deal with it. The third question was, how come the United States isn't contributing anything to the settlement of the North Korean situation? That's not true. As it turns out, thus far, Japan has contributed a few $1 million, and the Republic of Korea has contributed a few $1 million. They are on the hook, as they say, to over 10 years contribute billions of dollars, because that's the light water reactor project. The United States has said that it will take the leadership in attempting to put together the consortium to finance the purchase of the heavy fuel oil, $50 million a year. Everybody's aware of that. And so far this year, we have, in the United States, reprogrammed $19 million, $10 million to manage the spent fuel, $3 million for headquarters costs, and $5 million for, that doesn't quite add up to 19, does it? It's very close, though. And $5 million for heavy fuel oil purchases. So we have expended more than anybody else in the world so far. We're asking for $22 million for next fiscal year, and I'm struggling with my colleagues to convince the Congress to appropriate something on the order of $22 million. And we are working hard to get the rest of the world. Let me pick up a question. What about the rest of the world? I came back on Friday night from a whirlwind tour of Europe, 7 countries in 11 days. In an effort to get the Europeans to do more than they have so far to support the agreed framework, and we're pretty hopeful that either the Europeans bilaterally or through the European Union will do that. The Australians have already contributed $5 million, the Canadians a couple of million, the British have contributed, the Finns, the Italians are committed. We think we'll do pretty well here and there, not as well as we would have liked, but I think as time goes by and the framework continues to hold up, we'll get more and more support. The question about explaining the agreement to the United States, and did we do anything, if I got the question right, in the course of our negotiations that made it more difficult to defend it to the American people. And I think you saw an illustration of that a few minutes ago. Before we concluded the deal, we allowed the perception of the problem to be special inspections, because that was the issue that caused the IAEA to take the position it did and report it to the Security Council, and the issue over which sanctions were voted, a breach of their safeguards agreement. And it did not serve us to highlight other objectives which in fact were more important to us, because the more you tell your negotiating partner about how you value your objectives, then of course the harder they'll be to achieve. Then of course after you get what you want, you must then go back to the American people and explain that what you really wanted, even more than what you let them believe they wanted, was some other things. And sometimes, even though I say, trust me, I'm from the government, they don't. And so there is a little bit of that, I'm sure there, and there are probably other cases as well. The Russian reaction, didn't you think that maybe you could get the Russians to play a role here, and in so doing buy them off, export reactors to Iran? As it turns out, I was in Moscow a number of times talking to the Russians about what role they might play in the North Korea deal. As some of you may know, the Russians were, actually, the Soviets had a deal with the North Koreans to provide 4 of their 440 megawatt reactors that they build here and there, and that deal was stalled by the Russians, by the Soviets, for good non-proliferation reasons. The Russians were hopeful that in the course of making a settlement that involved light water reactors, their light water reactors could be sold, not an unreasonable hope. It was an unreasonable expectation, however, because there was no financing available for that. There was financing available for South Korean light water reactors, that's to say South Korean and Japanese financing. There was no financing available for the reactors that the North Koreans said they wanted. They wanted Russian reactors, and so did the Russians want to sell them, but there was nobody to pay for them. After the Russian reactors, they said they wanted French reactors, then you might have heard they wanted German reactors, then they wanted Westinghouse reactors, and we had the same answer. There's only one deal out there that can be financed, and it's South Korean light water reactors. A central role for South Korea in design, manufacture, construction, and financing of the reactors, and that's the deal the Japanese will support. That's the only deal. So we didn't have good news for Moscow with respect to being the fundamental supplier. On the other hand, there are roles out there for Russia and other countries to play, either in a subcontracting mode or in other elements of the settlement, and I don't exclude those from developing in the future. We, of course, as a separate matter, oppose anybody doing nuclear business with Iran. Our view of Iran is that it's different from North Korea. In North Korea, all those facilities are extant. In Iran, they're not there. Our objective is to avoid having Iran come to look like North Korea, so that we have to deal with it that way. Far better when we see Iranian intentions, as we do, that they never get the capability to match the intentions. The final question I took was, what are North Korea's real intentions, and were they really truly serious about nuclear weapons acquisition? In a general way, I'm not confident I can ever speak to North Korean real intentions. We have very much focused on what the North Koreans do and are prepared to do, and we can't help speculating about intentions, but that's risky business with a country that is as opaque as North Korea is to us. Not only was in the days of Kim Il-sung, but is in the days of Kim Jong-il. I, however, and personally have no doubt about the nuclear weapons program in North Korea. That was an extraordinary plutonium-producing set of facilities where energy production was something of an afterthought if you look at the design of the facilities and the way in which they went about pursuing them. So I'm quite confident that that was a genuine, massive nuclear weapons program, which is now frozen. What their intentions are with respect to that program is my personal view, that as long as there is nothing dramatic that perturbs this situation, either internally to North Korea or externally, that they will go through with this deal. If we deliver the light water reactor and heavy fuel oil, they will take apart those facilities and give up that program. They are concerned about, I believe, the survival of their political system. They do believe that they can enjoy the economic opening that all this will mean to them and not suffer the consequences of a political opening. That's how they're betting. I bet the other way. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. We appreciate you coming.